Okay, this should be chapter 4. Now, we're going to be, chapter 4 is, of course, on a lot of physiological aspects of being a baby. I get asked when we go through certain stages here, we're going to be using very specific terminology for it. But on the test, the terminology gets a lot simpler. So think of any of these things as the exact name of the stage doesn't particularly matter. So when we're talking about babies, it doesn't matter if we're using the term baby. It doesn't matter if we're using the term infant, because we're only talking about really one stage. So if you're on the test and you're like, what does he mean by baby? Well, there's only one type of person that we're talking about in the chapters here. So it's the same when we go over middle adulthood. When we go over middle adulthood, exactly what age are we talking about here for middle adulthood? Well, what age was it talking about in the chapters that we read for the weeks that are relevant to the chapter? The same thing with early adulthood or any of these things. So don't worry so much about memorizing exactly what the dates are. Just think of it as whatever age we're talking about in the lecture this week. Now for the new stuff here, we're going to talk about breastfeeding a little bit. They start to get into breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is a fantastic example of a few different things in development. First of all, it's a great example of kind of a trend that we have currently, where we want to believe that everybody has the right to parent in whatever way they want to, and up until a certain point, and that's okay because every parenting style is the same. Well, that's the nice thing about this class is we get to talk about facts instead of belief, and every parenting style isn't the same. If you breastfeed, is why it's just such a great example for it, because people really know the facts on breastfeeding. Whether you choose to breastfeed or don't choose to breastfeed is considered a choice. Yet, children who are breastfed are healthier, they're stronger, they're more intelligent, they're literally better humans than those who are not breastfed. So while it is a choice, it is almost a neglectful choice if you don't choose to do this. It is literally how we have developed to be humans. Now, by all means, there are a few exceptions. Some people can't breastfeed, like I think 0.5% of women, their breasts just don't produce milk, so, what can you do? But some people talk about convenience, but then it's almost a moral choice of, is the convenience worth permanently holding your children back just because you don't feel like going through the rigmarole of breastfeeding? And it's interesting because at the same time we like to feel, and we'll see this throughout the entire semester, at the same time we like to feel that everybody has their choice of how to raise their children, we then have these words like abuse and neglect that we'll get into later on as just horrible words to basically ever use. That we say, well, but if this is done, then this is horrible. And then we should just take the children away, and the parents don't even have right to be parents anymore. And we do this so in most states, for example, if you set your child who's 7 years old in front of a television and give him a movie, and while the movie is going on, you go out to the grocery store, buy groceries, and come back, the state will take your children for this. They'll call it neglect, and they'll call it abuse, emotional abuse, supportive abuse, and they'll take your children for it. Although it is far less damaging, even the possibility of damage is almost insignificant. There's a higher chance your house will be struck by lightning than like a fire will break out while your child is watching a movie. While something like breastfeeding, which is an invasion of freedom if we force everybody to breastfeed, is just pretty much 100% of the time going to impact the child's life. So keep this sort of stuff in mind when they go over, especially in the book. They get a little judgmental and touchy-feely when it comes to a lot of parenting things. Once we start talking about parenting freedoms, there usually is an actual better way that is just scientifically proven to have less damaging outcomes than the other way. As far as breeding, breastfeeding goes, we also get into taking feelings into consideration. Um, a lot of people, there are experts now called lactation consultants. There are no full-time lactation consultants. It's always kind of a part-time gig, um, a hat that a particular nurse wears in addition to other things. Um, but this, it's kind of and what these people do is they help the woman try to breastfeed, teach them to breastfeed. The interesting part is, as you look to some of the development of the baby in chapter 4, the baby needs no help in breastfeeding. They know exactly what they're doing. They're good at this. um, and it's a totally natural and very instinctual thing. They can't mess up. Obviously, we evolved for millions of years in order to be able to do this. Um, and it's this kind of choice aspect that we're having that makes it so the women are basically handicapping themselves by essentially stressing out to the point where they don't know how to do something natural anymore. Seriously, you put the baby somewhat, I could breastfeed. You put the baby somewhat near there, and the baby will turn, which is called a rooting response, and then he'll suck, which is called the sucking response, ironically enough. Um, and anybody can breastfeed. I could breastfeed. I wouldn't be producing a whole lot, uh, nothing at all actually, but I could go through the motions and it would work fine. Um, so there's a lot of things that we wind up kind of making more artificial, more complex than they need to be. The first few months of life are incredibly simple. Babies, we'll get into the emotional and cognitive development in a little while in the next chapters, but they basically can't learn at this point. There's almost nothing you can do to teach them. The physical development, this particular chapter, at least for the first couple of months, are pretty much all they can have. And then obviously these couple of chapters go up to about the age of 2, so that's when the emotional and the cognitive aspects really start to kick in. Um, Now, at this point, we're going to get into what I call the introduction to homeostasis. And during the childhood years, homeostasis is going to have a really big role. Homeostasis, by the way, is the adaptation to an environment. And this is something that is just something that everybody does. We have to do it. We adapt to our environment. We're really good at it. If we weren't, we would have died off, and a species that was better at adapting to our environment would have been the dominant species on the planet. But we're very, very good at this. And so homeostasis, the ability to adapt to an environment, not just mentally, but physically as well, is something that really kicks into play very strongly. You'll notice on page, what do we have here? Page 107, there's a great section that talks about cultural influences on physical development. And we like to pretend that that's not a real thing, that that our physical development is just physical. It has nothing to do whatsoever with our psychology or our environments. If your parents are large, you'll be large. If your parents are small, you'll be small. But that's really not the case. How you develop, what type of skills that you have, is very based on what you see, on what you perceive, on what you're exposed to, on what your culture values. So if you have uh, a culture that values a strange sport like basketball. We're pretty much the only culture that really gives a damn about basketball. And there's certain types of physiological skills that are developed when playing basketball. And they're totally different than a culture like that, than a sport like soccer, which has a totally different type of strategies and kind of back and forth with it, and sort of muscle development. And so our culture will never produce great soccer players. It'll just never happen because we're not exposing them to the right things. We're not teaching them to value the right sorts of things to be good at that. And other cultures will never really excel at basketball. Um, and we'll get into other things when we get into some of the physiological development, but But homeostasis is going to kind of come with us for the entire time. So, for example, if you are a smoker, and I know a lot of people, they know that smoking is bad for the children as a teratogen. We talked about teratogens before. So it's surprising, actually, how many women give up smoking while they're pregnant with no difficulties whatsoever. It kind of humbles the people that keep trying to smoke and they say it's too difficult, and then women who are pregnant, they seem to be able to give it up effortlessly just because it's important to them. But then when they have the kid, they start smoking again, which is relatively common. And but this is their homeostasis. This is their environment that they will adapt to. Their lungs will be weaker. It's kind of like a teratogen, but after after birth. And if they are in a place that has music on all the time, that will affect them. They will be predisposed to listen and analyze music, but at the expense of other things, because those are the neurological connections that are happening in the brain right now. They find, for example, that infants that are in a very musical environment, they're delayed in intellectual pursuits. They're basically not as smart as children who are adapted to different sorts of environments, because their rhythm, I guess, is what is developing at that time, and there's only so much they can develop at a particular time. Now on page 106, there's a table 4.2. Now this is a really good table that I want everybody to take a good look at, and there's a couple of things of note here that aren't obvious at first glance. Now, you'll see on one side there's average age that a particular feat is achieved. And then on the next column over is the age range in which 90% of infants achieve. Now, this is one of those times when you really have to keep in mind the difference between average and something else. Because people look at average and they say, well, this is what is expected. No, it isn't. This is the mathematic mean, the mathematic average of the ages, the massive amount of variability in a human when this happens. So if you look at, say, scribbling, for example, scribbling vigorously on a piece of paper with a crayon, the average age this happens is at 14 months. So maybe your child will do it earlier. Maybe they'll do it later. That really doesn't make that much of a difference. And people get really into the average ages during infant development. If you look to the other column, by the way, scribbling vigorously, 90% of infants develop this skill or capacity or habit, whatever you want to call it, between 10 and 21 months. Now, if you look at that, between 10 and 21 months, well, that average of 14 is really over near the 10, a lot more than the 21 at this point, which means that the curve there is going to be skewed to the low side. So most children are going to develop that near the average age. Yet at the same time, it's still relatively normal to go a very, very long time, 2 years pretty much, without developing this thing that a lot of people are developing at a year. And it doesn't mean that they're held back. It just means that that's not where their neurological connections, because keep in mind, this is the time when the neurological connections in the brain grow. I mean, they say that every part of your body dies and then is reborn except for your brain, except for the neurological connections. But at this point, the brain, and they talk about brain plasticity a bit in the text, this is when the brain is considered plastic, and that means moldable. It's like Play-Doh. It will really quickly adapt to a new environment. There are people, for example, that don't get spoken to. Their parents don't speak to them. And they will learn not to understand language very well. Because this is the time which their brain is going to adapt to that sort of thing. The other thing that they go over here is perception. Now, there's a rumor, I guess, that babies are born almost blind, they can't see very well, and it takes them a while to kick in the ability to see. This is both true and untrue. Yes, when babies are born, their eyesight is extremely blurry and they can't see very well at all. But remember, at this point in your life, you're adapting to everything really, really fast. And every second they are conscious, their eyes are seeing something. So that's one of the first things they adapt. Their eyesight is almost as good as an adult within 2 days. 2 days. Very, very short period of time. And if you look at a little newborn, they're not even focusing on anything anyway. They're like the lights are on, but nobody's home, generally speaking, with a newborn. And that's because their perception is altered. Um, Another thing that people say is that babies love to look at their mother's faces. And they can even tell their mother's face apart from somebody else's face. And they will attend to faces more than they'll attend to everything. And again, this is both true and untrue. You can't just take half a conversation and expect to know what's going on. It is true that babies will attend to faces. However, only after 2 months. Before 60 days are up, they will not follow faces. They will look at a face if it's moving around. If there's two objects that are moving around a lot, they're going to look at the moving face more than the moving fire truck. But that's about it. It takes them a while to really give a damn about anybody. They don't know their mother. They don't know their mother. They just haven't reached that developmental milestone yet. And that's fine. Now, like I said, on page 107, they talk about culture. Now, the cultural difference with physiology is a really good example of another kind of myth I mentioned I will always mention in any tip that I give for how to take my tests. I like to talk about myths and kind of debunk them, and then they have this nasty habit of showing up on the test. And the reason I do that is because these are things that if I can find something that you thought you knew before class and you were wrong about, and now you know how it actually works, it's a really good thing to test because it tests whether or not you've learned something in class, which is the entire point of the test to begin with. So if you thought that babies, when they were a month old could barely see anything, then now you have learned something. So it is adequate testing material. And one of the myths that we have is that science has a tendency to change its mind. And you hear this all the time. He's like, well, what we know today, we won't know tomorrow. History has this great tradition of changing its mind. In 1492, they knew the world was flat. In 1200, they knew that the sun revolved around the earth. And they keep changing their minds. Now, first of all, neither one of those things happens to be true. When Columbus came over in 1492, nobody thought the world was flat. Everybody knew the world was round. They just thought the world was actually about the size that it is, and they didn't know America was here. So they didn't think Columbus would have enough food to survive the trip across the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, which they were right about. He would not have been able to do that. He was saved by the fact that there was another continent in the middle of that. And in the 1200s, they knew, anybody who was well educated knew that the sun did not spin around the earth. But at the same time, we get this impression of science changing its mind. And for the most part, it's not true. There are a few things where we learn more than we did before. Whether eggs are bad for you or eggs are not bad for you, it depends on what we happen to know about the eggs in general. And when people say eggs are bad or eggs are good, they're really dumbing it down for you. They're talking about certain types of cholesterol. And then other types of cholesterol. They're not saying eggs are bad. They're saying this type of cholesterol is bad. And they find out eggs happen to have a different type of cholesterol in it in higher quantities. We find out that's more dangerous. So we're saying, okay, well, this type of cholesterol is actually really harmful for you, or this type is really good for you. Science is never really changing its mind about a whole lot. Most of the time, what's happening is that journalists are changing their mind. Where most people get their, frankly, idiotic opinions of science from. Because when you learn these things, all these things you think you know about science, most of the time you're learning it not from the actual article written by the scientist, but you're reading it from CNN.com or USA Today or something like that. So you're reading a journalist's interpretation of what the scientist said. So not only are you basically playing a game of telephone with facts, but the journalist probably isn't very qualified to read this stuff anyway. So you get a lot of these ideas that that change hands so many times that we get this interpretation that science itself is changing its mind, and generally it isn't. For this reason, don't disbelieve science. Honestly, don't even question it. When you hear about a scientific finding, don't question the science. Question the source that's telling you about the science. Scientists are not biased. Journalists are biased. The scientists that work for Monsanto, that do the GMOs and make genetically modify things, they are not predisposed to artificially finding out that their stuff is safe when it really isn't. They're not in fear of being fired because they work for the particular company. They're doing hundreds of experiments a day. Almost all of them are failures, and they're under extreme pressure to not kill people because the lawsuits would be insane. And all other scientists are the same way. We're extremely unbiased because we're only looking for the facts. It doesn't matter who we're working for. We find enough things that are beneficial to our employers so that the score of things that aren't beneficial is irrelevant. The reporting agencies are highly suspect. So I would highly encourage you, if you ever see something you don't believe, you see an article on CNN that says that one that I saw recently, it said that smoking marijuana can kill cancer. That seemed unbelievable. Just the very concept of sucking smoke into your lungs is good for them. It's stupid. So instead of just saying I'm not going to believe the scientist, I disbelieve the source, and then I go through the effort of looking up the article. And when I looked up the article, I found, the article didn't say that at all. The article was not saying that smoking pot cured cancer. The article was saying that one thing in pot smoke, if separated from pot and from pot smoke, did help with treating cancer. Then, of course, there's all the other aspects of the smoke going into your lungs. It's horrible for you. So I highly encourage that, which is why in the discussion sections, I go ahead and ask people to look up articles, to look things and post those as part of your arguments. And that way, when you're looking at somebody's argument, they can say something relatively shocking, but as long as they actually have facts to back it up and they got their facts from a good source, there's nothing actually questionable about it. It's just facts. You can only argue facts with facts. Now, a lot of the stuff in here is purely physical, and I know I said previously that wasn't necessarily psychology. We're going to go ahead and focus on it anyway, because you'll notice a lot of the things on here are, think about the physiological aspects from a very developmental standpoint. These are the things that that are shaping how the child grows physically, which is going to affect their psychological development later on.